Presidents also have the ability to call a special session. This happens if has adjourned. The technical term is called adjournment sine die, and what that means is that Congress is done for their current session. They're not going to meet anymore that year. They've all gone home. The president has the ability to call them back into session to deal with any issue that might have arisen that they didn't necessarily anticipate. In modern terms, this isn't that important of a power because Congress is typically in session for about 9 months a year, and they have a way to deal with these contingencies. Okay, executive powers of the president. The president has the executive power of the United States. So the president is in charge of taking care that the laws are executed, carried out, enforced. Deriving from that power, and in some instances mentioned elsewhere in the Constitution, the president has some other important powers. The president has the ability to appoint and remove other individuals to executive offices in the United States. This is more than just the cabinet. Cabinet appointees are 15 in number at the time of this recording, but however, the president will appoint literally thousands of executives. Thousands of people are appointed by the president, or at least under his authority, not just the 15 people on the cabinet. The ability to remove executives excludes commissioners of independent regulatory commissions. So as a typical rule, any appointee to the executive branch made by the president can be removed by the president with or without cause. These individuals serve at the pleasure of the president. The major exception to this is going to be commissioners of independent regulatory commissions. Another executive power of the president is the ability to issue executive orders. An executive order is an order that is issued by the president that says how a law, a treaty, constitutional provision, or judicial decision will be enforced, and it can interpret those policies as well. The ability to issue executive orders is executive in nature. It is not legislative. Legislative powers deal with those powers that are concerned with the creation of statutory law. An executive order deals with how statutory law or other types of policy are carried out, and it is derived from the president's power as chief executive, explicitly stated in the Take Care Clause of the Constitution. So these executive orders express the president's opinion as to how something should be executed, and they can also interpret that policy as well, because you can't enforce something until you define exactly what it is. Now, the president's interpretation of a law isn't final. The judiciary can say, whenever it deals with it in a case, can say, well, you got it wrong, Mr. President. However, until the judiciary overturns the president's interpretation, that's effectively what the law means. Another executive power of the president is executive privilege. Executive privilege is the ability of the president to have private or privileged communications with his subordinates. These communications cannot be called into question by Congress or anyone else other than for purposes of a criminal investigation. The reason why the president has this power is because he needs a free flow of information. We all know that sometimes the best way to get information is to get it privately as opposed to publicly. This allows the subordinate to provide the president with information that may be not politically expedient, may be politically embarrassing, but the president still needs to know it. And this way, since it is private, the subordinate can feel free to share that information with the president. Diplomatic powers of the president. The president has the power to appoint diplomats. This would include various ambassadors, ministers, envoys. Also would include the power to appoint the Secretary of State and the Deputy Secretary of State and other people in the State Department that are concerned with representing the United States to other countries and in international organizations. The president has the power of diplomatic recognition. Strictly speaking, this is derived from the power to appoint ambassadors, but we refer to it separately to allow for clarification. The power of diplomatic recognition is the president's ability to decide with which governments we will have foreign relations. It's not to say that we recognize that a country exists, it's to say that we recognize that a government, in our eyes, is legitimate and we will engage in foreign relations with it. As an example, the United States obviously recognizes that there's a country called Iran, but we don't necessarily recognize its government. Oftentimes, there may be two governments vying for recognition. Under international law, you can only recognize one government per country. Example would be China. There are actually two governments for China, one on mainland China and one in Taiwan. Both claim to be the government of all of China. Under international law, we have to pick one and say that that is the government that we believe is legitimate. In the 1970s, Nixon moved our recognition from the nationalist government in Taiwan to the communist government on mainland China. The president has the ability to negotiate treaties, or at least have treaties negotiated in his name. Now, a treaty will not be public policy in the United States. It will not have the effect of law unless and until the Senate, by 2/3 majority vote, approves the treaty. So presidents, if they are smart, will include senators or at least get some senatorial input in the negotiation process so that the ratification process can be successful. To get around this rule, presidents frequently rely upon what are called executive agreements, where a treaty is an agreement between the United States and a foreign country. An executive agreement is an agreement between the leaders of the countries themselves. Executive agreements do not tie the hands of the United States as where a treaty would. We've committed ourselves to a specific policy. It's been approved by 2/3 of the Senate, and it creates public policy in the United States. An executive agreement does not bind the United States, and executive agreements can be undone simply by the sole action of a future president. Military powers of the president. The president is commander-in-chief of the United States military. As previously stated, what this means is the president has actual direct control over the military. In the absence of any congressional legislation, because Congress does have the authority to pass laws regulating the military, the president can issue executive orders that will dictate how the military will operate. The president has other military powers deriving from his power as commander-in-chief or mentioned elsewhere in the Constitution. These include the ability to command the military directly, the ability to commission all officers. All military officers derive their commissions from the President of the United States, and he can dismiss those individuals as well. The President has the authority to appoint the civilian leadership of the military. The civilian leadership, such as the Secretary of Defense, the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, and so forth, are not members of the military. Rather, they are civilians put in leadership over the military. Again, the idea is that we will have civilian control of the military in the United States. In the area of the military, or war-making power, there is frequent conflict between the President and Congress. The Congress has the sole power to declare war. It appropriates money to the military. It writes rules for the military. It is the only one that can institute the draft. Congress has significant military power. The president, however, is the commander-in-chief, and as stated on the previous slide, he has several and very important military powers. Where does congressional power to regulate the military end and the president's power as commander-in-chief begin? Nobody really knows. Does the president need a declaration of war to use the military? No. Does this mean that the president can use the military anytime, any way he wants without congressional approval? No, it doesn't mean that either. These are not legal questions, but rather they are political questions with political answers. There is no bright dividing line between the power of Congress and the power of the president with regard to the military. Again, these are political questions. In the modern context, the relationship between the president and Congress regarding the military has changed. For the most part, we would assume that the founders intended that the Congress would be consulted for major military operations. However, with the advent of nuclear weapons, this isn't necessarily possible. The president has to have the ability to launch nuclear weapons as part of our deterrence strategy without consulting Congress. Missiles launched from pretty much anywhere on the face of the earth or can reach the United States within 30 minutes to an hour, depending upon the technology of the time. A sub-launched missile can hit the eastern seaboard in 10 minutes from its launch time. So the president, to deter this, has to be able to say that we will respond massively with a counterattack of our own. Because of the nature of the time frame, Congress would never be able to be consulted. Another thing that's happened with regard to the relationship between Congress and the president in regard to military power would be the result of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War for the United States began far before Johnson, but presidents took the United States to war step by step, inch by inch, incrementally, to make it such that war became inevitable. First, we start with advisors, then the advisors we send some more advisors, then we have a base of operations, then we provide supplies, then we provide combat troops to protect the supplies and the base of operations, and so forth. And long story short, we end up in the middle of the conflict. Students, whenever they think about the Vietnam War, frequently believe that Congress did not authorize it. This is factually incorrect. Congress did authorize the Vietnam War. Absolutely. They authorized it with the passage of what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the President of the United States to use whatever means necessary to repel communist aggression in Southeast Asia. No, Congress did not use the words or the verbiage declare war. However, nothing would be different if they did. The Constitution doesn't require that Congress use the words declare war. What it does require is that for major military operations, the Congress must approve. The most recent conflict of the United States at the time of this recording is the war in Iraq. Did Congress declare war on Iraq? No. Did Congress authorize the use of military force before the war started? Absolutely they did. Now, coming out of Vietnam is going to be a desire on the part of Congress not to allow a president to take the nation to a point where war becomes inevitable. So Congress passes in the 1970s a piece of legislation called the War Powers Resolution. Happened in 1973. This is sometimes mistakenly called the War Powers Act. The War Powers Resolution has several provisions. The first thing that it has is it requires that the president notify Congress within 48 hours of hostile action. Upon receiving notification, Congress has several actions that it can take, and we'll talk about those in just a second. The War Powers Resolution provides a time limit. In the absence of any congressional authorization, it provides a time limit of 60 days for operations. At the end of this 60-day period, again, if Congress does nothing, the president is then confined to a 30-day time period for withdrawal. It is factually incorrect to say that the War Powers Resolution authorizes the president to use the military for 90 days. It does not. What it does stipulate is that there are 60 days for operations, followed by a 30-day withdrawal period. Whenever Congress is notified, Congress has several options. Upon receiving notification, Congress can immediately say withdrawal. If that, according to the provisions of the War Powers Resolution, if Congress orders a withdrawal, then the president has 30 days to withdraw. He must cease operations and then withdraw the combat troops. The War Powers Resolution also gives Congress the ability to extend the time limit or to shorten the time limit. For example, the Congress could receive notification, and the Congress could then impose a 30-day limit on operations, and then the president would have 30 days, followed by a 30-day period for withdrawal. Congress could also impose a longer time limit, and at any point in time, Congress can change its mind and order an immediate withdrawal. There's a great deal of debate as to the constitutionality of the War Powers Resolution. Many legal scholars believe that it is not constitutional because it resembles a legislative veto that the Supreme Court has taken a very dim view of. Another question would be, how could the Supreme Court deal with the War Powers Resolution? There'd be questions of standing. Also, the court would probably want to look at the political question doctrine. However, Even if the War Powers Resolution is found to be unconstitutional, Congress always has the ability to end a conflict that it finds objectionable by ending funding for it. And that is how it ended the war in Vietnam, was by ending funding.